Saturday, August 4th. Oh, King of Kings and Alpha and Omega, I am definitely going to go crazy. First of all, that beef-brained Beth Ann, she called here 4 times this morning wanting to talk to Carl Ray. The first 2 times I said he was still in bed and I wasn't going to wake him up. The third time she begged and moaned, so I went up to wake him and he wasn't there. So I told her that, and she wanted to know where he was. I said, "I'm not my brother's keeper, Beth Ann." She said, "He's not your stupid brother, Mary Lou." She called again an hour later and wanted to know if he was back yet. I said, "Nope." She wanted to know when he would be back. I said, "I'm not my brother's Then Carl Ray came home. I told him about besotted Beth Ann. He said he'd call her later. I said, "Good for you, Carl Ray." I was glad he didn't go rushing to the phone. Then I asked him if he'd drive me to the drugstore. I didn't have to go to the drugstore, but I knew that was the only way I was going to get him alone so he could tell me the rest of the story about the ring. I should mention, however, that before Carl Ray came home, I called Alex again. He wasn't home. I'm going to die. So Carl Ray and I got in the car. "Okay," I said, "finish your story. And don't give me any business about what story. You know exactly what I mean. About Mrs. Furtz. She wanted to know where you got the stupid ring, and you told her that Mr. Furtz gave it to you. And I asked why, and you didn't answer. And by the way, I want to know exactly why you came here to Easton and exactly who your father is. I want to know it all, Carl Ray." He gave me one of those mournful looks. "I came here because my mother said that my father, the real one, lived here in Easton." In Easton? God, Easton? I was trying to think of everybody I knew who was old enough to be Carl Ray's father. I had this horrible thought that, what if it was my father? That was too horrible to even think about. Then I thought of Mr. Furtz. But Mr. Furtz was dead, and besides, he didn't even know Carl Ray until Carl Ray got a job at the hardware store. Then I thought of Mr. Cheevy for some reason, and as soon as I thought of Mr. Cheevy, I thought, of course, Mr. Cheevy has those long arms and those long legs and that skinny body and that little bitty head and those freckles. Boy, have I been stupid. And that other stuff, the money and the college education, must have come from his real father. Of course. Mr. Cheevy has lots of money. But, ugh, Alex and Carl Ray, his brothers? Ugh, I said. "Who is it? Who is your father?" "You don't have to yell." I do. I stopped. I counted to 20. I breathed deeply. "Okay, Carl Ray," I said in this very sweet and soft voice. "Did you find your father here in Easton?" He nodded. Softly, sweetly, I said, "Who is it, Carl Ray?" He looked mournful. "I have to do one more thing first, and then I'll tell you." "Urgh! And when might that be? I am only asking for an approximate time. Tomorrow? Wednesday? Next week? Next year? In 10 years? Pretty soon." "Very good. Very good indeed, Carl Ray. Thank you for telling me all of this. Sometimes when you talk with Carl Ray for a while, you begin to lose your marbles and talk like an idiot." Sunday, August 5th. Oh, King of Kings, Alex is home, finally. I haven't seen him yet. I called and called his house all day and was just about to expire from despair because no one was home. No answer, no nothing. And then, after dinner, he called. They made a side trip to visit some old friend of his father's, and that's why they didn't go back on Tuesday. He's fine. He missed me, and he wants me to go over there tomorrow. Maybe Carl Ray will drive me over. I don't think I can wait until tomorrow night. God, I'm hopeless. Right after I finished talking to Alex, the phone rang, and Maggie answered it. And she said it was for Carl Ray. He mainly listened, and every once in a while he would say, "Yep," and "Okay." I knew it wasn't Beth Ann because when he's talking to her on the phone, he messes with his hair. When he hung up, I said, "So who was it?" He said, "Just somebody, nothing important." Honestly, I didn't even ask him about any of his secrets. I think the trick with Carl Ray is that you have to give him a little time. You have to be patient. I am going to learn to be more patient. Monday, August 6th. Oh, deity, omnipotent, Alpha and Omega, King of Kings, and Supreme Being. You won't believe it. You really won't. But then again, maybe you will. Maybe you haven't been as stupid as I have been. Calm down, Mary Lou. Tell it from the beginning. First of all, while Carl Ray was at work today, the mail came, and there was a letter from for Carl Ray from Aunt Radine. I kept looking at the letter. I held it to the light, but couldn't see anything at all. Then I examined the flap to see if it would open easily, stuck down tighter than anything. I thought about trying to steam it open, but the last time I did that with one of Maggie's letters, I burned my hand. And it didn't work anyway, and Maggie could tell someone had been trying to get her letter open, and she went berserk. So I had to wait. As soon as Carl Ray got home, I gave him the letter. Then I stood there while he looked at it. He didn't open it. He started up to his room. I said, "It's from your mother." He said, "I know." God. Then I asked him if he'd take me over to Alex's after dinner. He said, "Sure," and went on upstairs. He came down for dinner with a tie on. Everybody started teasing him. "Going out with Beth Ann?" Dennis asked. "Hot date, huh?" "Didn't know you owned a tie, Carl Ray," Maggie said. But Carl Ray just ate his dinner. Then he drove me to Alex's. He seemed so nervous. I figured Aunt Radine must have really shaken him up by her letter. So I said, "What did your mom have to say?" Stuff." "Yeah, stuff like what? I get right to the point, don't I? So much for patience." "She told me that I could tell people about my real father if I wanted to. She said she had a long talk with my other father, the Carl Joe one, and he understands now why I was so mad at first and why I had to come up here to find him. The other father, Carl Joe, was jealous," she said. I counted to 10. "So is it okay for you to tell who your real father is? Can you tell me now? Can you?" He pulled into the big boy parking lot and stopped the car. I counted to 20. I breathed very deeply. Then he said it. He just came right out and said, "Mr. Fertz is my father." Holy cow, Alpha and Omega. All I could say was, "Oh, Mr. Fertz?" And Carl Ray sat there nodding like an idiot. But all of a sudden, he started to cry. And all of a sudden, I remembered that Mr. Fertz was dead. And so I started patting Carl Ray on the shoulder. "Mr. Fertz!" When he calmed down a little, he told me the whole story. If I put it down just as Carl Ray said it, with me in between counting to 30 and 40 and 50 and holding my breath, it would take me a whole journal. So I'll summarize it to the best of my ability. Here goes. When Aunt Radine first told Carl Ray that Uncle Carl Joe was not his real father, Carl Ray was really mad. He thought she should have told him sooner. He made her tell him who it really was, and she said it was a man named Charlie Fertz. Aunt Radine and Mr. Fertz had been dating for a year when they went to a New Year's Eve party in Easton. That's the party my parents talk about, where Uncle Carl Joe and Aunt Radine fell in love at first sight. Aunt Radine stopped dating Mr. Fertz and started seeing Uncle Carl Joe, and right away, they knew they were going to get married. Then Aunt Radine discovered she was pregnant, and it was Mr. Fertz's baby. Does that sound like a soap opera or what? But Uncle Carl Joe said it didn't matter to him. So they got married right away, and nobody ever knew that Carl Ray was anybody's baby but their own. Then, about 6 months ago, Aunt Radine read an article in a magazine that said you should always tell children, if they were adopted, that they had the right to know. Uncle Carl Joe didn't think she should tell Carl Ray because he wasn't exactly adopted. Aunt Radine was his real mother after all. And Uncle Carl Joe said, "What's father anyway? Isn't it someone who raises a child as his own?" But Aunt Radine worried and worried, and finally she told Carl Ray, "Are you following this?" Anyway, she could not have known Carl Ray would go all berserk on her, and that he would insist on knowing who his real father was and where he lived. As soon as Aunt Radine told him it was Charlie Furtz and he lived in Easton, at least she thought he still lived there, Carl Ray said he was going to find him and no one could stop him. Uncle Carl Joe got mad. That's when Aunt Radine wrote to my parents asking if Carl Ray could come up here and stay with us a while. "God," I said, "did you know Mr. Furtz lived right across the street from us?" Carl Ray said no. He had looked in the phone book under Furtz, and there was one Charles Furtz who lived on the other side of Easton. Carl Ray went to that address, but the lady living there said the Furtzes had moved to a bigger house. She wasn't sure where this bigger house was. He was all depressed. But that very night, he came outside when Dennis and I were sitting on the curb, and he heard us say the name Furtz, and he couldn't believe it. He decided it was fate. The next day he went to the hardware store, and he told Mr. Furtz who he was, and that he was Mr. Furtz's son. "God," I said, "what did he say? Was he mad? Did he believe you?" "He just looked at me a long time and asked me when my birthday was, and he thought a while and said that, well, I did look like him a little bit. He wanted to call my mother, but when I said she didn't have a phone, he said he would write to her. Then he offered me a job, and on the first day of work, he gave me the ring." It was Mr. Furtz's ring. That's when I realized that Mr. Furtz, Charlie, and Uncle Carl Joe, and Carl Ray all have the same initials, C.F. Carl Ray nodded. "I didn't know this then, but my mother had given him that ring a long time ago. That day he went to the doctor and then to the hospital, and a few days later," Carl Ray started crying again. It was awful. I was crying too. Later, Carl Ray said that he only just learned from Mr. Biggers that when Mr. Furtz heard that he had to go into the hospital, he was afraid he was going to die. He had a premonition. So he contacted Mr. Biggers. The money, the college education, that was from Mr. Furtz? Boy, have I been stupid. I should have guessed this a long time ago. I've been so wrapped up in Alex Cheevy that I didn't see anything right in front of my nose. Carl Ray said that yes, it was all from Mr. Furtz, although Mr. Biggers didn't tell him that at the time. Carl Ray didn't know that for sure until he went home and told Aunt Radine everything. She was very upset about Mr. Furtz dying. She wished Carl Ray had told her that sooner. He felt real bad about that, I could tell. But Aunt Radine said that would explain the letter she got from Mr. Furtz saying he wanted to leave something for Carl Ray. And she had written back saying only, "You don't have to." But apparently, Mr. Furtz didn't get that letter. He was dead already. Mrs. Furtz got it, and she didn't understand it. When we got back from West Virginia, Carl Ray went to Mr. Biggers again, and he said he needed to know if it was Mr. Furtz who gave him the money. And Mr. Biggers said he would have to check if he could divulge the name. That's who called Carl Ray on Sunday, Mr. Biggers. And he said, yes, it was Mr. Furtz who had left Carl Ray the money and all. How am I doing? Like I said, this took Carl Ray hours to spit out. Sometime in there, I asked Carl Ray if he had told Mrs. Furtz any of this, and he said that yes, he told her today. Well, God, I said, was she mad? I bet she was really mad, wasn't she? She didn't even know that you were Mr. Fritz's son? He said, nope, she didn't know. But I think she was a little relieved. Relieved? She said odd things had been happening. First, right after Mr. Furtz died, a letter arrived for him that said, Dear Charlie, you don't have to. Sincerely, Radine. Mrs. Furtz thought he had been seeing some other woman. Then I gave her the ring, and she knew it was Mr. Furtz's. He had always kept it in this little box on his dresser. and he told her it was from an old girlfriend. He never wore it. She couldn't figure out how I got it. She thought I stole it. Can you imagine that? Didn't you want to know why Mr. Fritz never told her about you? When I told her that Mr. Fritz only just found out himself that I was his son, right before he went in the hospital, she said that she knew he would have told her soon enough. And when I got ready to leave, she said, I'm just glad to know that there's a little more Charlie left in the world now that he's gone. Can you imagine that? It made me cry. So, we sat there a long time. I felt real bad for Carl Ray. Why did Mr. Fritz have to die after Carl Ray found him? Finally, Carl Ray started the car again. And when we pulled into Alex's driveway, I asked him where he was going, all dressed up. Carl Ray said, to the cemetery. I want to talk to my father. Oh, well, I started bawling like mad, and Carl Ray had to pat me on the shoulder. Then I asked him if he wanted me to come with him, but he said, nope. When Alex answered the door, he just stood there. He looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. I thought I was going to die. Oh boy, I thought he doesn't like me anymore. Then I thought, I look terrible from all this crying. And he's thinking that I'm uglier than he remembered. Then he thought he's going to tell me that it's over. We're finished. He seemed so nervous. I thought, sure, he ought to be nervous. He's going to tell me it's all over, and maybe he thinks I'll punch him or something. Come on in, he said. On the antique side of the room was Mrs. Cheevy, and on the modern side was Mr. Cheevy. When they saw us, they jumped. So, who's going to start? Mrs. Cheevy said. We looked at her. Start what? Then Mrs. Cheevy said, Okay. Let's start with Mary Kay. Oh, a rhyme. Okay, Mary Kay. It's Mary Lou, Alex said. Then, all of a sudden, I started talking. I was so upset about Carl Ray, I had to tell someone. So I told them all about Carl Ray and Mr. Fritz. I went on and on and on. I told them everything. They kept saying, oh, poor Carl Ray, and how astonishing, and poor Mr. Fritz, and on and on. And after I finished babbling away like an idiot, I felt better. Then Alex said, want to go see my fishing lures? The funny thing is Alex really does have a collection of fishing lures. We went out into the garage to look at them, and then it happened. The big event. He kissed me. Sigh. Right there. In the garage. Beside the fishing lures. He just leaned over and kissed me. It was simple as anything. Still, I was glad I had practiced. And you know what? It didn't taste a bit like chicken. Sigh. After the kiss, we looked at some more fishing lures. It was a little embarrassing, if you want to know the truth. I am sure we were both thinking, wow, we did it. We kissed. Wow. And there we were saying things like, oh, that's a nice lure. And here's my favorite. And all that sum and substance. Then, right before we went back into the house, we kissed one more time. I started that one. I figured maybe it was my turn. Is that how it goes? Sigh. Finally, Mr. Cheevy took me home. And right after I got home, Carl Ray returned and told everybody at my house his whole long, sad, complicated story. I thought they were going to keel over at least a dozen times. Carl Ray didn't cry again, but everybody kept telling him how sorry they were about Mr. Fritz. It was as if Mr. Fritz had just that very day died all over again. While I was sitting there listening to Carl Ray, I kept looking at my parents, and I decided I was going to pay more attention to them from now on. I really am. You know what Carl Ray said? I'm lucky, actually. I still have a real father. And we all knew exactly what he meant. Uncle Carl Joe is his real father because, as he says, a father is someone who raises you and takes care of you. I kept thinking about this time when I was much younger. I was lying in bed one night, feeling very sick. I must have been moaning or something because my dad came in the room. I told him my stomach was going crazy. He asked me if I was going to throw up, and when I said maybe, he said I should sit up, and then Before I could even get to the bathroom, I started throwing up. And do you know what he did? He put his hands out to catch it. I threw up right into his hands. And I remember thinking, even though I was only about 7 years old at the time, wow, only a mother or father would do that. And I'm sure Uncle Carl Joe has done lots of things like that for Carl Ray.